Welcome to the Living Word Podcast. I am your host, Geneviève, and these episodes serve as a reminder to how essential your fullest expression is on this planet during one of the most transformative times in our history. Together, we are going to explore truth through vulnerable conversations about life's deeper meaning, exploring holistic wellness, mindset, spirituality, entrepreneurship, love, and everything in between. Let's dive in, shall we? Welcome back, everyone, to the Living Word, episode 26. This first season, 26 episodes, and all of you who are coming back every 2 weeks, thank you from the depths of my heart. And this is one of the last guests I'll have on this season, and it's going to be a good one. But just a reminder to go back and give a review, a star rating. That really helps the show thrive, whether you're on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, wherever you are. That would be so appreciative. But today we're diving into a really transformative conversation with Dr. Kristy Prouse, who's a highly esteemed OBGYN, and she's an expert in women's health who has dedicated her career to bridging the gap between conventional medicine, functional medicine, and so much more in between. What I find so amazing is she has such a vast background in hormonal health, regenerative medicine, patient-centered care. And Dr. Prouse is truly revolutionizing the way we approach women's wellness. And in this episode, we're going to explore her perspective. We're going to talk about the powerful role that women are playing in the future of medicine. So, Kristy, thank you so much for joining me today. And I'll say that the first time I saw your resume, like I told you, I was so impressed, but even more so when I met you for the first time. Even now I have the flutters. It almost like takes my breath away because I recognize that the true heart-centered impact and leadership that you carry along with that incredible accolades that you have is something that I really I'm inspired by for you. And behind all of those titles is just such an incredible woman that you are. And before we dive into anything, I'd love for you to introduce yourself and just share a little bit about what inspired you to pursue medicine and ultimately become a leader in women's health.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. I am excited to be here and nice to have an exchange and just unload, unpack. Yeah. So what got me interested in medicine? I think, I've always followed my heart, and thankfully I have always followed my heart, despite my grade 10 and then again in grade 12 guidance counselors suggesting that women, shouldn't go into medicine, shouldn't go into engineering because they're not good at math and science. And I was told that despite my aptitude testing suggesting that that would be the perfect career. So, thank goodness I never listened to that. And I really did follow my heart. Biology has always been, the common thread through everything that I have done. And, have got an undergraduate degree in psychology, a BA in psychology, a Bachelor of Science in genetics and cell biology. So really getting at the nitty-gritty cellular level. And then I went on to do my medical degree at Queen's here in Canada, and then did obstetrics and gynecology training at the University of Calgary and practiced conventional medicine, labor and delivery, operating room for over a decade, delivered a ton of babies along the way. And, and of course, life and, I've got my own twin girls at home and all that sort of catching up with me. When it started catching up with me, it was a bit of a conundrum, a bit of a challenge, because the reality is that I really, really, really loved obstetrics and gynecology. And I had promised myself at the beginning of my career, looking at a lot of the other established OBGYNs who were incredibly grumpy, pretty much universally. And no surprises. It's a very demanding specialty. There's no question. And I think, the late nights and whatnot, I just didn't want to be that. And I had always said that if the shine ever comes off, then, well, I'll just stop. I'll just do whatever. That's really easy to say when you actually don't believe it's ever going to happen. And, as much as I loved what I was doing, you can love what you're doing and be going full tilt and the shine come off. The physiologic consequences of going too hard, too fast, too long does catch up with you. And that's what we identify as being burnout. But in actual fact, it's a physiologic hormonal imbalance, dysregulation that, lends you to feeling fatigued, foggy thinking, emotional lability where, things are flying out of your mouth that, you didn't see that coming. And certainly, it's not you. And before you know it, was a time when I didn't really understand what was going on. Like I did on some level. And yet at the same time, my conventional wisdom didn't really answer the individual symptomatology that I was experiencing. And so that's when, I kind of laugh at it now, given what I'm doing, but I, out of desperation, ended up seeing a naturopathic doctor and a traditional Chinese medicine doctor all in the same morning, because that's what a type A personality does. And they, right? And they came to the very same conclusion for me. And that's when I thought, okay, wait a second. I am surely not going to be the only one that is struggling like this. And so I made what may not be appreciated as much, but a pretty courageous decision to actually leave that world that I had known and really dedicated my entire adult, life efforts to one endpoint. And now here am I. What am I going to do with my surgical skills? Like, how does that translate to any other area but the operating room, right? So, there definitely was a feeling like, I'm trapped here unless I'm doing, half time or sharing a practice or too early to retire. What am I going to do? And it was really, as I say, that physician heal thyself that was the ding. Okay. The other challenge, of course, is that I was stepping out of the conventional paradigm. I was not only from a medical standpoint, but as far as a healthcare system in Canada and how we operate, that was taking a leap in a direction that certainly wasn't familiar to me, and only familiar to a few, plastic surgeons and whatnot, that how they operate their practice in this country. And that was back in 2011. And I really haven't looked back, and really glad for that whole process. I mean, I won't share all the nitty gritty, ugly details, but basically, I really needed to have my roof blown off and my walls torn down right to my foundation, because it was giving me the opportunity to rebuild. And in that rebuilding, I could rebuild in a much stronger, solid, sensible, practical way. And it allowed me to show up a whole lot differently than I used to. Not that I think others would necessarily notice that change per se, but I do, because I'm way more productive than I ever was, and I would have been productive back then. Just I've come to a peace that transcends all understanding, like the Apostle Paul talks about, right? And when you can surrender and understand that you're watched over and you can trust, wow, what a difference is that? And now, do I get stressed? Yeah, but it is about that stressed, and it lasts about that long, and and it's gone. Really, really appreciate my journey and the transformation that had to come along with that, because it was much needed.
I didn't know this piece of your story, and hearing how much your own personal journey has influenced how you show up for women gives me a whole new level of appreciation, because having someone like yourself who's really able to you stay very neutral and look at all possibilities. And I know for myself, when they told me I had 86 cysts on my ovaries and 2 6-centimeter fibroids at 25, and they were like, hysterectomy, do this is dangerous. And it was kind of the same feeling in my heart, like, this doesn't feel right. And I share that because you've really forged your own path, which I believe is essential. I really believe we're in the most incredible time right now, where people like yourself can openly talk about how there are other ways to go about things. And one of the things that you said that made me laugh, but now gives you a whole new understanding, is you said, women's hormonal health and menopause got really sexy after Halle Berry had a hot flash. That made me laugh. Yet now hearing like how much that stress really influenced where you went in that version of your career, I'll say, makes me understand a lot more why you were talking about how cortisol dysregulation is a silent epidemic for many women, and you experienced it yourself. It was mind, body, spirit, the influence that it had. Would you be open to talking a little bit more about that? Because now it has a whole new meaning, understanding that you navigated that within your own system and spirit.
Yeah. And it was actually really important, even when I was showing up for my patients, right? Because it happened in such a condensed and accelerated time frame for me that it allowed me to show up for my patients and to identify very easily and readily, because it had just happened to me, where they were at, and to be able to insert and elevate, meet people where they were at. And, we're just living in a day and age that no generation has lived before. And we are all, going 150 miles an hour, doing 150% and normalizing it. And you can hear it in our language. We compare ourselves to others. Well, Susie's, doing all of this and she seems to be keeping it together, or I used to always do it this way. Why am I struggling now? And that's, it's just such a faulty construct, right? We have, whether it be our families or society, have really set these expectations that this is how we need to show up in order to, be valued or recognized or whatever. And yet a lot of these things, the overachieving, nose to the grindstone, multitasking, is classically set up for cortisol dysregulation. And yet this is what we are putting on a pedestal, right? So it's the very same things that, will serve you well in some regards and kill you slowly at the same time. And that's basically what was happening to me. Like, the joy was being sucked out of me, and it just didn't need to be that way. And I think, had I understood much younger, because in hindsight, I actually probably burnt out a couple of times before I truly crashed and burned. But, had I understood that a long time ago, I probably would have shown up differently. And yet at the same time, I am, certainly, land on the more stubborn end of the spectrum. So, do I have to learn things for myself? Yeah, clearly I did. And maybe it wouldn't have been so dramatic and impactful had I, made some shifts and changes early on. I don't regret or mind how it happened for me. And I do see how that translates to the care of other women, and really understanding, again, the physiology behind it, to go back right to the genetics and cell biology, which is my background. I love that nitty gritty, and I love that physiology and really understanding what's going on. And from a hormone perspective, as you say, we get fixated on the, I suppose, what is more obvious, the perimenopause, menopause. Believe you me, I think it's awesome that it's getting a lot of airtime. Thank you, Halle Berry. However, I think in some ways it's, hey, look over here, when in actual fact, we should be looking over here at a very foundational level. And so from a hormone perspective, and a physiologic perspective, we've got to start with the cellular level, the hormone level. Those are all foundational areas. And if we don't get that figured out, we're going to be chasing our tail with absolutely every other system, every other hormone. And so to ignore that cortisol piece of it is a big gap, and particularly a big gap in conventional medicine. Conventional medicine, they will look at the extremes of disease, Addison's and Cushing's. And thankfully, most people don't fall into that category. But it doesn't mean that there isn't this spectrum in this area where women like myself are falling into. It just so happens that around the perimenopause and menopausal timeframe, it really shows up in a way that most women can't ignore it, because, in a lot of ways, and sort of simply put, stress is additive and it's cumulative, right? So we're dealing with our lifetime's worth of stress in this moment in time, unless we've had major changes and major upheavals and made, corrections to how we're showing up in the world. But the reality is, women in their late 50s into their early 50s, it's a bit of a perfect storm. They've got this underlying cortisol issue going on, the sandwich generation, and they've got this hormonal shift that's happening as well. And I think, it's important to understand too, that when I'm talking about stress, yeah, sure, it is the emotional and psychological stressors, and that's where our head goes to when we think of stress. It's also physical stressors to the body. So things like infections and inflammation and food sensitivities and environmental toxins, right? That really requires that we call on cortisol in some way, form, or another to combat it. And so when you erode that foundation, that's basically undermines and touches every other system. And that's why it's just so core that we don't get lost in the shiny perimenopause and menopause. Again, absolutely not to detract or ignore it by any stretch of imagination, but we really ought to be looking at foundational things that we can change, because that's where people get better and stay better. Mind, body, spirit aspect of healing.
That makes so much sense. And at the beginning, you said the I used to's, and I definitely can recognize that for myself still is. I have to really stop myself and ask, why is that a comparison? Why is that still being attached to my worth? Because that was a big one for me, the burnout, and I can feel it creeping up now. I'm actually in Tulum today at one of the clinics I'm partnered with, and people come down because there's all these symptoms all the time, and we really want to get to that underlying, like you're talking about. But one of the things I've never understood about cortisol and the effect that it has on the body. Is there an amount of time that it can take for the body to reset? I really believe I was addicted to that adrenaline, cortisol for a long time, and it's still there. I can catch myself being like, oh, it is like a drug. So what does that look like? Does it ever go back to status quo? What does that mean for us?
Yeah. Well, and it's good, by the way, that you are self-reflecting, because I think that's a step that a lot of people sometimes are afraid to do, is to look in the mirror and really ask themselves, some of the tougher questions, like, why do I show up the way that I do? And really start to question that. Because when we do start to question that, it's amazing the answers that we come up with. And you really start to understand, wait a second, like, I only do it that way because I was told that I was supposed to do it that way, not because it was healthy or practical or realistic even. So good for you that you are at least taking that opportunity to reflect and ask yourself, why am I doing this? Why am I attached to this? And do I need to make change? And that change it's not a moment in time. Usually, if it's a big thing, it's a practiced, right? You have to keep choosing otherwise until it eventually becomes a habit, and then you don't have to think about it anymore. But that transition and giving up old habits, yeah, for sure, has its challenges. To speak to the cortisol dysregulation, can you feel better? Absolutely. It is more difficult for some people than others. And, some of us, just constitutionally speaking, have, a body that is not nearly as well equipped as others. So for example, the person that was born as a premature baby, right? They may not have the same capacity for stress as others might have. So there's constitutional differences. But then I also think I love the leaky bucket analogy. And we're all leaky buckets. It's just some of us are leakier than others, and there's periods of time in our lives where we are leakier than we are at other times. And it's really just a matter of how many holes in your leaky bucket can you plug, and what efforts are you putting into filling your bucket. And sometimes that filling your bucket is easy, just sort of lifestyle modifications if, your degree of leakiness isn't that big a deal. But if you've really been hammered and you're doing all the right things, you're eating right, you're not over exercising, your sleep hygiene is really good, but you're still feeling awful. Yeah, that's where sometimes intervention is important and is the way to fill that leaky bucket more rapidly. And I say deliberately rapidly because there is some magic to that. An empty bucket obviously feels gross. A bucket that is half filled, there tends to be good days and bad days. And a full bucket, the physical body is still doing this, but you don't notice it. You don't feel it. So the idea is, let's get a full bucket. And when you get beyond that half bucket full from a physical body perspective, instead of the downward spiral that people seem to get trapped in when there's an underlying cortisol issue, you hit that half full bucket, and then things start to spiral upward, and you start healing faster and feeling better. And so it's just getting that initial half bucket under your belt, and at a time when you don't feel well. So it's a bit of a fake it till you make it type scenario, where you got to put one foot in front of the other. You got to take your supplements. You've got to make the big changes that you need to make. And it just keeps getting easier and easier. So yeah, do you have to continue to feel that way? No, it just depends on how early in the game are you catching it.
I love that. And I think we can all take a moment today and really just take a moment to go inwards and see, like, where is my bucket at? And I'll remember when I first started actually sleeping well, it was life-changing. And I didn't even know how much my sleep was interrupting everything in my life. I thought I was functioning really well. I thought that workout, which was giving me the adrenaline, it was overriding the need for sleep and all of these amazing things. So thank you for that analogy of just like checking in and where am I at? And that's what I love so much, Kristy, talking to you, is that you've worked with so many top medical professionals and you've trained and educated countless others also. And hearing the way that you talk about both of these sides of functional medicine and conventional medicine, do you see a blend coming together more effectively? Like, what is that? My dad was a holistic practitioner, and he passed away suddenly at 59. And if he saw where we're going right now, I think it would have given him so much joy to know that we really are on a tipping point. And I can't help but smile because I feel like we were all here for this time. So what do you see from your lens? Because that is a very different lens than most of us.
Yeah. And I would agree wholeheartedly with you, is that things are changing, things are shifting. I think one of the things that's important to understand about medicine in North America is that this was unified at one point in time. It was at
Really?
the turn of the century where, some wealthy families donated money to various medical schools and set up libraries for them. And then in return, of course, the request came in that, you know, if you're, thank you for doing that. And now, if we could eliminate naturopathic medicine, homeopathic medicine, bioenergetic medicine from the curriculum, understanding that these wealthy families, were, again, at the turn of the century, were behind the pharmaceutical industry as well. So there was this divide that was created, and largely North America, you get a very different flavor when you're in Europe, for example, and you see a doctor. I mean, they're just as likely to recommend an herbal remedy as they are a pharmaceutical remedy. So I think what we're seeing here is not only a return to a more holistic approach and a more natural approach, but then with the advancements of science and longevity medicine, functional medicine, regenerative medicine, whatever label we're going to slap on it, that's where we're really starting to see a different shift and a different way of looking at medicine and a paradigm shift. It would certainly seem that the silos of medicine, although I can completely see why the conventional medical approach has done that. I mean, as a gynecologist, right? I mean, I just always laugh, like, isn't it the purpose of the heart to pump blood to the uterus? You know, it's just we don't necessarily need to silo it that way. And when you start healing on a cellular level, it's amazing what systems come on board. So it's positively impacting the heart at the same time that it's positively impacting the pelvic organs, and so you get this system-wide healing from healing at a cellular level. The challenge really stems from change. It's hard for a lot of people to embrace change and to switch. And I can tell you firsthand, the most difficult thing that I had to do in this whole process was some of the unlearning of how to see things. And then once I sort of got my head wrapped around, wait a second, no, if you look at it from this direction, you will see it differently. And it doesn't, by the way, I'm not dismissing conventional medicine. I mean, my goodness, right? It's acute care, particularly good. I'm having a heart attack. As I said, the other day, I'm not showing up on my naturopath's doorstep. There is great value in our conventional approach when it comes to acute care. And I think on the other hand, when we're talking about chronic disease prevention, there are definitely different ways that we could be looking at it, and that's starting to happen. And there's some very vocal doctors out there that are breaking down some of these barriers. And I think we're seeing a big shift in the United States. And it's not surprising that a lot of what happens in the U.S. does translate to the rest of the world in varying degrees, whether we like it or not. It just is. It's so it is an exciting time, and I actually never really thought that I would be around to see it happen in the way that it's happening. But I think we're about to see the cresting of the wave and about to change. But it's not just a way of thinking in medicine. It's about changing of systems,
Right.
medical systems too, and that in and of itself has its challenges, right? And so to cram a functional medicine approach into, at least here in Canada, but in the States as well, to force that into the conventional medical approach, it just doesn't make sense. You can't cram it into a 15-minute appointment when you're talking to your patient for 45 minutes, an hour. It's just a different approach, a different way of looking at things.
I love that you said you didn't think that you would see it in this time, which is so hopeful. That actually makes it even more exciting. And just for all of us to recognize that it's like you said, we don't need to look at one is good and one is bad. I really do believe that when we're open to all possibilities, and not just in health, in every aspect of life, there is always more than one side, one opportunity. And I think that that's a really healthy thing. And we've been divided. And every time I hear you talking about some of the little side notes, I'm like, I can't wait for us to have a dinner conversation, because there's so many avenues of what's shaped this world and why we think the way we do. And one of the bravest questions we can ask ourselves is, do I fundamentally believe this in my heart, or is this something that I've learned? And so it's so powerful that you say that. And you have twins. I think that's so exciting. Hayden and I have had a few dreams about having twins. So that is something that I find very fascinating. I'm not sure how old they are, but do you also see a renewal of the lens that young people are seeing things at? Like, how much of an impact do you feel that has on this change of the world that we're seeing?
Yeah, they're 24 years old now. And it's very interesting. I perhaps see it maybe more in my younger patients than I do in my own kids from a health perspective. Like there really does seem to be an uptick in young people wanting to manage their care before they run into difficulties, right? It's much more interested in what they're eating, how they're eating, the exercise component to it. Even on the sort of biohacking side, there seems to be this whole new generation of kids who are really keen to understand some of the nitty gritty about themselves and how they can feed into that. But I think generally speaking too, the other shift that I'm seeing, and again, like I can say I've lived long enough now to see a couple of decades, more than a couple of decades pass. I also think that there's a return to more conservative values. And I don't mean that necessarily politically conservative, but just more, like less drinking, less frolicking, less, just a more honest showing up, and that too is refreshing. I'm a kid of the 80s, and as much fun as it was back then, and certainly generations have passed, but it felt like it was getting worse beyond that. And I really feel like there is a shift and there is a change, and a positive change. And maybe we're talking about a generation, this one or the next, that is much like we look back on the 50s and think, our parents' generation, what a cool time to be, alive. So, time will tell, but I do feel like there is that also shift just in mindset and approach, more thoughtful, more aware, more in touch than I was at that age, for sure.
Hearing that from you brings me joy, because I live in a place, I live in Playa del Carmen, I'm in Tulum all the time, where I live in a melting pot of people who actively come down here looking for a different way of life, who have this core value of wanting to, whatever liberation means to them or freedom leaves to them, like they're searching for that. And so we don't really have like boundaries of countries and nationalities here. It's all one. And so I'm very used to seeing that now. But hearing that from your perspective is so beautiful, because human beings are fascinating. We are fascinating species. And I think when we really start to look even in the neuroscience and how that affects our everyday life, that's what really fascinates me. And so I'm really grateful for all of your opinions, all of our conversations. And what I would love to ask you is, I really do feel that women's wellness is a very intricate system that is giving a tapestry for so many other areas of our life, where we see how many things come into play with each other. I would love to know from your perspective, to leave the women with today who are listening, what is one of the places that you are focusing a lot of your own attention, whether it's mind, body, spirit, all three? And what would you love to leave with women today to not feel overwhelmed by all of this, to actually feel empowered that a lot of the answers really are inside?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it really is around that whole surrender piece. And, we do try and control a lot of things that we can't control. And that's exhausting because we can't control it. So it doesn't matter how much we invest in it. And, so I think having the wisdom to distinguish, to discern between where you need to put your energies and your efforts and your focus, and letting the others not necessarily fall away, but let them be as they are going to be, because we can't change so many of our circumstances. And part of that surrender, I think it's often mistaken that means no action or inaction. And that really isn't the case, because actually the act of surrendering is an act. But I also think too, more importantly, is understanding who and what you're surrendering to. And, when you understand that there is a God, a divine, that you are surrendering to, that becomes a ton easier. And interestingly, when you make that leap, it's amazing how then things start to fall into place in your world and in your life. And when things don't necessarily go as we hope or intended, it's just that much easier to roll with it when you understand that, well, it was supposed to be that way, and it was meant to be that way, and therefore it's okay. And so I think that's probably the biggest piece is checking in with that surrender piece of it. And are you actually surrendering?
That brought tears to my eyes. You are such a bright light, and everything you speak about, and today I am fully aligned with, and you have a way of articulating it to make it so simple, but also so contemplative, and really sitting with, what am I surrendering to? And I can feel my heart expand. And I want to thank you so much for having this incredible lens, from having so much background personally, clinically, experientially, and bringing it together to really be a light for so many of us. And I cannot wait to hear what everyone's takeaways from this was. And just thank you for giving me even more hope in what's happening in the world, and that incredible women like you are leading the charge. Kristy, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Absolutely my pleasure to hang out with you for a bit.
Thank you so much for joining me on the Living Word podcast today. My hope is that you have something new or a remembrance that you can apply in your life right now. Isn't that the whole point of us learning and growing? To take new understandings and alchemize them through our own human experience? Please like and leave a comment or review if you enjoyed this episode, and share it with people in your life who would benefit from hearing it also. Make sure you subscribe to the Living Word podcast on your favorite platform and be the first to know about upcoming episodes. Sending so much love and gratitude to be on this journey together. See you soon.